You're listening to Edge of Faith, a multimedia magazine where we discuss art and culture through a Christian lens. Well, Alan, thank you so much for stopping what you're doing and taking the time to talk with us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Tired, but well.
Great. So, we're talking about your book, Disruptive Witness, Speaking Truth in a Distracted Age. Now, it addresses technology, although that's not the whole focus of the book. And it's not a technology is the boogeyman kind of book either. But you do address technology in it. And so in this issue, that's what it's all about. So perhaps we could start by you talking a bit about your thoughts on technology today and how that affects the human dynamic.
Excellent question. Yeah, so I think there are two approaches that Christians can take when we're thinking about, or just people in general, when we're thinking about the effects of technology. So one question is technology a net benefit to our communities, to our society, our culture, human civilization, human flourishing? The other question is, how can we live in a community, in a society that is so governed by technology, and in the case of my book, governed by specifically forces or technology of distraction. So in my book, I focus on the latter question, and here's why. I think it's really good for people to ask the question: is technology healthy for us? How is it forming? How is it forming us? How is it deforming us and disordering us? How is it harmful? And what are ways that we can personally cut back and restrain and limit ourselves so that we can live more flourishing lives? I think authors like Andy Crouch in his book Tech-Wise Family do a good job of addressing that question. But for me, there's this other question. Let's say that everybody, all the evangelicals, read Andy Crouch's book, and they decide, okay, I'm going to severely cut back my use of technology. That's wonderful. But the vast majority of people in society are still going to use smartphones for hours a day. They're still going to watch television for hours a day. They're still going to be reliant upon technology. And so for me, the greater question, or the question I want to focus on is, what do we do about that? Because it's great if we decide, okay, I'm going to limit my use of technology, but if our neighbors are not, and we can't legislate them to do it, to cut back, then we need to ask the question, okay, well, how is their media usage, how is their technology usage going to change the way we try to witness to them, to bear witness to our faith, the ways we try to love and nurture them?
Right, absolutely. And that's an excellent point is, as Christians, we might, and focusing on Andy's book, we have all the music and games and all those things, and we interact with each other in the living room, but everyone else is going to have that technology, so we definitely have to keep a mindset of how do we address that. It's wonderful. In that same vein, and I don't know that it's all caused from technology, but technology has certainly exacerbated the issue, is multitasking. People just thrive on multitasking, save a few seconds here, shave a minute there. Obviously, we can't really multitask, but that's not the question. But you bring up that whole multitasking and a lot of interesting data around that. And I was hoping that maybe you could share some of that data and then lead into your discussion about mindful movement, because I think that's great and the readers would really like to hear that.
That's a great question. I don't have the data right in front of me, but what I can say is that we like to think that we can multitask. Our technology, our devices encourage us to multitask. Our jobs encourage us to multitask. Society, we have all these societal forces encouraging us to do multiple things at once. Listen to music and drive, while you're doing work, answer emails while typing a report, while listening to a podcast, all these sorts of things. We're encouraged to multitask, and there is an addictive quality to it. And when we're doing it, we have the illusion that we're actually being productive, that we're actually accomplishing it. But the reality, as I've studied it, is that people aren't actually multitasking. The vast majority of people, what they're doing is they're actually rapidly switching between one task and another. So your brain is jumping from one thing to another thing, to another thing, to another thing. Now, if you imagine yourself physically jumping from one task to another, to another, to another, you can imagine what the effect is going to be. You're going to be exhausted, right? Because that's a lot of work. If every minute you're moving from one task to another physically, it's like caring for a toddler, for example. Mm-hmm. It's exhausting. Well, one of the fascinating things that I discovered in reading some of the research is that kind of mental fatigue happens to us as well. And that was kind of reassuring to me, because I feel that sort of brain fatigue at the end of the day as I am talking to students, prepping for, because I teach at a college, prepping for courses, reading, and then in between that, my wife's texting me about the kids, and I'm trying to listen to music so I can focus and not listen to people in the hall. And by the time you're done with all of that, your mind is just exhausted. There's like a fuzziness or a cloud that your mind is in. Multitasking makes it harder to make good decisions because of what it does to our minds. So that's some of the dangers of multitasking. The mindfulness movement is a movement heavily based in Silicon Valley, but it's elsewhere, that in some ways in many ways tries to combat the effects of distraction and multitasking on our minds. But it takes it, I think in the book I describe it as sort of taking some of the methods of transcendental meditation and stripping them utterly of the religious aspects, so that it's pure life hacking, I think they would call it, right? So, right. And the goal there is to get yourself into a state where you can focus on the present, because our minds are so pulled toward the next thing, something in front of us, something going on, that it's hard for us to just be in the moment. And in the book, I try to use the mindfulness movement as an example, as sort of a canary in the coal mine, as an example that, we have a problem. If we need movements to try to restructure our brains, because we've so distorted them with this technology, that's a sign that we have a sort of a societal sickness.
Right, absolutely. I know you get into that even deeper throughout the book on just the ability to have prolonged, deeper thought rather than recursory thinking, which is what most people are resolved with today. I mean, it kind of reminds me, I remember who did the quote, but it was a president that was eating dinner with a bunch of congressmen and said that they hadn't had so many great minds eating together since Thomas Jefferson was eating by himself. Because back then they had time to think, and today it's stacks of papers, read through it, and move on. So another cool concept you discuss in the book is you borrowed a phrase from Charles Taylor on the buffered self. Perhaps you could discuss that somewhat and tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so Charles Taylor is a Canadian Catholic philosopher who studies mostly the history of philosophy. Brilliant man, wrote this book called A Secular Age, which heavily influenced my book and my dissertation and a lot of people. It's a fantastic 800-page book. And in this, he's studying how we got to this, what he calls secular age. And one of the identifying marks he denotes is that we've become what he calls buffered selves. Now, to understand a buffered self, I think it's helpful to think about the opposite of that, the older model of a self, which he calls a porous self. So the example I would give is somebody living in Europe during the Middle Ages. If you were alive in the Middle Ages in Europe, you would understand, you would believe, as everyone else would believe, that the world is inhabited by spirits, that God can affect you, that sin can actually cause you physical illness and pain, that you can go to holy places and be impacted by things, that the sacraments have a physical effect. They have an ontological effect on you, whether you want to believe it, whether you want to accept it or not. Like they have a force, they have a power in the world. So this was an enchanted world, and the key here is that yourself, your personhood, was not protected from it. That's not a thing. You lived in a world where the transcendent could impact you. It could influence you, and you had little control over that. But today, we live as what he calls buffered selves. So I like to think of it, the illustration I've been using is imagining that you walk around with a bumper all the way around you. And you bump up against ideas and people and beliefs and maybe even spiritual things, but you have to reach out your hand over that bumper to grab what it is that you want and choose to bring it into yourself. And that's the kind of model of a buffered self that he writes about, that modern people tend to think of themselves as. We tend to think that even if there is a transcendent existence out there, it doesn't penetrate us, it doesn't affect us unless we choose to allow it. And so part of this has to do with rationalism and radical autonomy. We think of ourselves as rational minds that choose to believe in God or choose to believe in the transcendent. But the transcendent God is not something that penetrates and affects our lives, which is, of course, against what historic Christianity teaches in very clear ways.
Yeah. As I was reading that section, and it really kind of moved me, and I was very interested, was, it has that whole, when you're opening, as you said, that bumper to analyze something, it's, how does that define or help me? So it's more about me than about the external. There is no external objective truth. It's, I guess, what a lot of people would call ultramodernism. Other people call it postmodernity, where there is nothing but subjective truth. It's great for you, but that doesn't really help me with what I want. So it's not real for me, but it is real for you, right? And when you're thinking about that in terms of technology, it made me think of social media, and particularly things like Instagram, where some people post some really great scenery, architecture, beautiful things. But there's so many people today that you look at their Instagram and it's this 400 posts of nothing but themselves. I mean, not doing anything interesting either. It's just them. And you're like, wow, the world is revolved around you. And then you have this postmodernity mixed with, technology. It's like they're catalysts for each other, and it's just escalating it, right?
Absolutely. No, I think that's a very important point. Well, so I want to say two things about that. Yeah, I think you're right about postmodernity being wrapped up in all these concepts. But I will say that I think, and I think Taylor would back me up here, that this concept of the buffered self affects a lot of Christians too. Christians who would explicitly say, I believe in absolute truth. I am not a postmodernist. I believe that it's out there. But there's still this sense that at the end of the day, they are autonomous, that they are these rational thinkers that elect, that choose things for themselves. And so I think, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I wrote this book to the church, because I think that we need to hear a lot of this too. Now, as to your point about Instagram, I think, that's so important, what you said about how these forces working together. Expressive individualism is, I think, the working basic belief system of the vast majority of people in the industrial West. Expressive individualism, which is this idea that you become justified, your existence becomes justified and meaningful when you create or identify, discover an identity within yourself, and then you express that identity. And because that's the basic belief system, it's interesting because social media is perfectly designed to facilitate and encourage and invite that, right? So if I decide that myself, is a professor who's really smart and people should respect me, and I feel alive and I feel that my life is worth living and that it's meaningful when I signal to other people this is who I am, then Instagram is a fantastic tool for me to feel spiritually justified. Because what I can do is I can pose myself, in a sports coat with patches on the elbows and a pipe, reading a book in a reading chair, and I can, frame all of these things that says to the world, this is who I am. My existence matters because I have a clear identity which I am expressing. And I think, and so there, the way I approach this phenomenon is not so much from the angle of narcissism, although that can play a role, but from the angle that people who are wrapped up in expressive individualism, which may show up in an Instagram feed that is completely made up of selfies. These are people that have been taught by society that they are only as valuable as the identity that they create and promote. And they are following what they've been taught. And the tragedy here is that it is soul-sucking. It is crushing. It's never enough. You're never satisfied. There are never enough Instagram likes to make you feel that your existence matters. So you always end up feeling empty and longing for more. And it is a tragedy. It is a tragedy.
That's an interesting way to leave that it's never enough and you're alone. I know I've talked to several people from third world countries that don't have nearly the technology, and one of the first things they experience when they're visiting the States is how lonely everyone is.
Yes.
So it's amazing.
It is unbelievable. I just read a couple days ago that the UK just established a minister of loneliness to address loneliness in the UK. I mean, it's just I feel like if you're paying attention to our times, you have to conclude that we have a deep societal sickness.
I concur completely. So, speaking of the fact that you said you were writing to Christians and leading up from the things we've been talking about, you also write in your book about how the church adds to this problem by emphasizing marketing and branding. So how do you think that plays into the millennials' disenchantment of the church today?
Yeah, I think, I've been having a lot of conversations since the book came out about this very topic. And I do think it can go both ways. I think younger Christians and younger people in general can break one of two ways. And I think they can break pretty hard. So one is when a church very intentionally picks up the business model of church planting, where you're thinking about entrepreneurship and you're thinking about all the techniques and styles and the branding and marketing that you can read about and study in contemporary entrepreneurial studies, and they're applying that to the church. I think there are some young people who find that attractive. So they want services that have high production quality. They want sermons that give that where you walk away with some life lesson that you can quickly apply. So you have something tangible that, some value added, as it were. They want, they want very, nice branding, clear demarcation of what this church is compared to other churches based on branding and logos and language and marketing and things like that. I think some millennials, that's attractive to them, just like it is for older Christians. And I think it's because, Jamie Smith, the Reformed theologian, philosopher, talks a lot about secular liturgies, and our consumer market has its own liturgies, and it has taught us. I mean, I think branding is its own kind of liturgy. It teaches us how to evaluate things and how to judge them, and that's what we're used to. So when a church uses those models, there's something familiar and safe and warm and comfortable about those. So some millennials, I think, see that and they're pulled toward it. My fear is that when a life crisis happens, or when they have a reason to question or doubt a traditional Orthodox belief in the faith, that those kinds of churches won't be able to provide them the foundation to reject or to hold true to the faith, because they're not founded on the roots of the faith. They're founded more on, a marketing aesthetic. Now, I think other millennials, and this is, I think, what you're hinting at, other millennials see that there's really no meaningful distinction between some of those churches and a concert or a TED Talk. And for them, there's this felt emptiness. It doesn't, their lives already feel hollow and empty as they live in those kinds of marketing and business and entrepreneur and commercial spaces. And so moving into a church that just picks up all of that, all those aesthetics and styles, that's going to leave them just as empty. And so for them, they see that and, they want to run the other way.
Yeah, absolutely. In that same vein, I guess I'd like to point out that I'm not picking on millennials. They're just younger, so we're talking about the up and coming. Yeah. I know the millennials get such a bad rap. You're like, wow, enough with the millennials already. And of course, now we're getting into what is that? Generation Z. So the millennials will go,
is that what it is?
Great, we don't have to talk about us anymore. So. In any case, that's really some good points. And we're coming up close to the end of the interview, so perhaps you'd like to just give your final thoughts, what you'd like to leave the reader to contemplate on.
So I guess here's what I would say. In the book, I make the argument that the traditional way that we've thought about sharing our faith, whether explicitly or implicitly through our lives, is confronted by two barriers. One is the barrier of technology of distraction, which inclines people to not have deep thoughts about things. It inclines us to trivialize things. And the other is secularism, which sort of flattens all belief into a consumer preference. And I argue that both of those things make it hard for people, when we're communicating the gospel to them, to hear that gospel as something unique and grounded and important and essential and otherworldly. And so, my argument is for a disruptive witness, the kind of witness that on one hand encourages and incentivizes people to slowly contemplate the faith, contemplate the gospel, contemplate what we're talking to them about, and also to understand that we're not just offering them a nice lifestyle choice, that it's something categorically distinct from that. What I guess I would like to leave people with, I obviously encourage people to pick up the book and read it. And as I've been talking to people over the last 2 weeks now that it's been out about the book, there have been so many interesting conversations about how these ideas apply to everything from the arts to education, to where how to build a sort of scriptural argument for a disruptive witness, which I don't particularly focus on, although I do ground it somewhat in Scripture. There's a lot to discuss here, how pastors can apply this practically, and I would encourage people to have those conversations amongst yourselves. If you're interested, invite me out to speak. I'd be happy to expand on those. I'm hoping to start a conversation, and I think this book really just sort of skims the surface on a much larger topic.
Very interesting. Well, we want to thank you again. The name of the book, Disruptive Witness, Speaking Truth in a Distracted Age by Alan Noble. And thanks for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.